When Darkest Dungeon was released in 2016, it was heralded as an incredibly frustrating but quite rewarding roguelite. I can remember the primary mechanic stress leading to some incredibly high and incredibly low moments in gaming. I can't tell you how many boss fights where my main DPS found her mettle and gave me just what I needed to win a fight, gave me like buffing my teammates, shouting words of encouragement, etc. Or sometimes my tank just failed miserably, had a horrible breakdown, decided to cower in the back, and I knew a team wipe was soon to follow. Darkest Dungeon really embraced forcing the player to start over and rebuild, and that's what made it both frustrating but also incredibly exciting. In comes Chaos Zero Nightmare with their own little version of the stress mechanic. It's simpler, but it has some positive elements, and some players have rightly criticized a little bit how simple it is, but you have to remember, it's in the context of a gacha game, it's a little bit different in scope. So I'm going to compare the two and give my own recommendations for how they can preserve some of what made Darkest Dungeon more memorable without introducing too much of the frustration of losing your characters permanently. Darkest Dungeon had a stress meter that ranged from 0 to 200, and there were two thresholds. There was a check at 100, where you had a chance of getting an affliction and chance of getting a virtue, and at 200 you had permadeath. And so at 100 there was a 75%, the default was 75% chance of failing and having an affliction and 25% chance of success and getting some kind of virtue. But there were all kinds of ways you could interact with that. There were trinkets and baubles, there were things in the town, your own character's quirks that affected your odds of succeeding and failing, and all that drove these super memorable moments where you're fighting some really hard boss battle, you've just spent 30 minutes, 45 minutes grinding to get here, and you're not sure if your character has it in them to figure it out and fight through to the end. So Chaos Zero is a little bit different. Their meter range, I believe it only goes to 50 numerically, just that's relevant if you have cards that reduce stress by 5 or something like that, so it's about 10%. But the number goes to 50 and you have a guaranteed breakdown. There's 0 chance of virtue, no chance of resolve. It's always going to be the breakdown. And then of course, when you have the breakdown, you have the card draw restoration. Your character can't do anything for several turns. You have to use cards, which reduces the enemy's action count. You lose a third of your HP bar. And of course, the cool thing is you get the ego cost reduction on restore. You get a very cheap ego skill when that character comes back, but it's not as exciting because it's 100% guaranteed, right? You know it's coming, and then okay, I get to get to see the animation. It's kind of cool, but it's not as exciting because there's no probability associated with it, right? And then of course, Chaos Zero Nightmare was a little bit simpler because the primary stress source was damage centric. Healing weakly reduces stress, but right now it's mostly you take damage, you have stress. I don't think we saw any enemies that specifically targeted stress, and that's something I want to talk about a little bit later. And so in lieu of those probability related mechanics where you have the affliction and the virtue chance, they do have an epiphany mechanic in CZN, which is mostly as fun, where your character has a little light bulb, you unlock a new card, or you upgrade a new card, or you get the divine version of cards that is a separate excitement driver, and it fulfills the role well. I think that's super fun when you get to do that. But you can also tell that CZN in general, it appears they tuned the game for a little bit less frustration than Darkest Dungeon, which again I think is reasonable because it's a gacha game. We can't deal with too much frustration, to be real. And so some of the key differences are like random versus guaranteed outcomes, right? The breadth of interactions. Darkest Dungeon is just much broader, and much of the game is built around it. CZN is trying to keep things a little simpler. When your character dies, they don't have permadeath. They just go and get their mind wiped, and you can rebuild them. It's not like you worked and spent your way up to level 4 armor for a character, they died, and now you have to start with a replacement character back at level 1 armor, right? There's a little bit more of a narrative element to how Darkest Dungeon designed their stress system. When your character was afflicted, they would start, showing up voice lines for how they're sabotaging their own team. They start attacking them. They start skipping turns. When you tell them, hey, I want you to grab the gold, they take it for themselves, or they hide it, or they go buff the enemy team or something like that. It was very obvious what was happening. In CZN, it's much, much, much simpler. The characters don't have any voice lines, so they just kind of do their little or whatever as they're playing their cards. And I thought that was really fun about Darkest Dungeon, especially when you had the virtue. You could see your character giving the buffs, encouraging your team, hurting the enemy even more. All these different things were super fun and engaging that don't exist in CZN as they are today. And even more than that, it wasn't always obvious how the character damage you were receiving was going to interact with your character's stress levels, because your 3 characters have independent stress levels. But my friends and I were talking as we were playing the game. It wasn't obvious who was going to take the stress. You would go through a run, and Mika would take all of the stress, and Tressa would take none of the stress, and your Cassius would take like 10% of the stress, and you would have no idea why it was divvied up that way. And so your random unit that decided to be the target of the stress for the entire run would just take up they would constantly be out of commission, constantly getting their upgraded ego skills, and it wasn't clear. Darkest Dungeon had a lot more interactability because you could see, because positioning mattered, right? Your enemies would target the back, target the front, target all of you. You would get to see their abilities like that and understand positioning, and so far I haven't seen that in CZN, and maybe we'll see that as we interact with more bosses and more enemies as we go further along in the game. But right now it's kind of just a crapshoot which of your characters is going to be out of commission with stress, and you just kind of have to take your lumps with that. I can specifically remember I did a whole run trying to just get a good Kayron build, but I couldn't because Kayron was perma-stressed. He was always out. I never got to play his cards. He never got epiphanies, and it was just at the end, it was like, well, this wasn't a Kayron run because he was constantly out. And so it is not lost on me that this game is less than 1 month away from release. It's not like they can make major changes, but these are just things I would think about as ways to introduce that random element that made it super fun in Darkest Dungeon. The first would be obviously to convert the guaranteed breakdown into a probabilistic resolve check. I don't know what that number is. Maybe do 75-25, where they're probably going to be afflicted, but there is a chance of a virtue, and you could make that virtue be buffs or some kind of more damage or something like that. But you could also make it epiphanies, right? Maybe lower the chance of natural epiphanies and make the epiphany something that happens at 50 stress. And so you could make that super exciting that way when you're fighting a super hard boss or something like that. I think this would almost be a guaranteed win if you implement it in terms of making the game more exciting and less deterministic, right? The second thing, I didn't see this, they may already be in the game, but I would make sure you have enemies that deal pure stress. Right now, one of the strongest comps in the game is just building a crap ton of shields, never taking damage, and you're just not going to be stressed because your characters take no damage, they take no stress. And so having enemies that ignore shields, ignore heals or whatever, and just deal stress damage, I think that'd be super fun. The third is have more cards and abilities that interact with stress. And again, we didn't see every card and ability in the game, but I don't think there were many. I think I can think of one neutral card that reduced stress a little bit. I know Orlea has one epiphany upgrade that can reduce stress, but it's not a lot. You can reduce it at the campfires. But aside from that, there's not a lot of things that interact with it. And it'd be super fun to have characters that interact with stress, characters that do better when their allies are more stressed, or characters that do better when their allies were afflicted and had a breakdown. Think about a character that just gets stronger if you only have 2/3 your health bar, and you're super excited for them not to be the one that broke down because they get better, right? All those kinds of synergies that you can make the system much more interactive instead of purely a stress is bad. You can say, oh, when you hit the 50 stress, sometimes it's good. And sometimes characters like having high stress, and it's not always the worst thing in the world. You may get a cool card out of it. All these things make it a little bit more exciting, just with a little bit more of a chance element, but it's just my personal opinion. Right now we have all of the 4-stars have different kinds of interactions, whether it be interacting with specific game mechanics, whether it be dots or healing or draw or more action points. Most of the bases seem to be covered, but there aren't any units that really like to interact with the stress mechanic. And I think having, maybe one 4-star and a couple 5-stars down the road that really enjoy interacting with that could be really fun for those of us players that really like the stress mechanic. So all in all, I think there are some things that CZN could add to the game to make the stress mechanic just a little bit more involved. You don't have to fully commit to the Darkest Dungeon level of pain and frustration and permadeath and all that, but there's some kinds of no regret adds that they could do to the game to make it a little bit more fun, a little bit more probability, so that things aren't guaranteed. Your ego skill isn't super exciting to get the discount when you're always going to get it. So these are some suggestions I have, but as always, I want to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments. Do you agree, disagree? What kinds of things would you change to make the system better, or would you leave it as it is? And you're like, okay, it is what it is. And as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one.